Today I have an interesting story to share with you about a former and ex-L3 Harris executive who pled guilty to selling 0 days to a Russian broker. Are you familiar with L3 Harris? Ever heard that name before? Well, if you've been watching my channel from the beginning, you'll know that I've talked about some of their products. Well, L3 Harris is a defense contractor, and what they do is they actually build things to exploit radio, software-based exploitation, operating systems, things like that. But for the most part, they're well known for their IMSI Catcher products, such as the Stingray, the Hailstorm, are just a few of their many radio-based products. Now, they make all kinds of tactical radios. They work on exploitation of the various generations of the telecom network. Well, this is an executive who actually worked for this company, and he worked as an executive, so he had a very high standing in the company. And in this case, it sounds like he was selling 8 different 0-day exploits, according to the article and the court documents, to a Russian-linked broker in exchange for millions. And I'll give some of my opinion on this as well, so I do have some other thoughts, but let's go into this. So he's 39 years old, he pled guilty, he may get 10 years in prison for this, and apparently he had trusted access. They used air-gapped computers. They had very strict regulation on how these types of pieces of software, hardware, well, software in this case, were accessed. So they had everything from Faraday boxes to prevent any kind of communication between various important devices at the company. I've been reading up on it. So according to this, he also served as a member of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is like, the NSA kind of thing. And basically surveillance, all of this stuff. And this is a high-level executive. He apparently took millions of dollars in cryptocurrency in exchange for 8 different 0-day exploits, according to this. Now, is it truly a 0-day exploit, or is it something that might be considered 0-day as in unreleased? That part, not entirely sure from the vagueness in the court documents. I've actually been looking into it to try and find out what types of exploits. So apparently, according to this, during the hearing, a post tied to this Russian company, Company 3 as they refer to it in the court documents, advertised millions of exploits tied to iOS and Android, which, as you know, are the main 2 phone types in the world. So they were able to put 2 and 2 together with this article through various sources, including on X or Twitter, because while the court documents only referred to it as Company 3, there was a direct quote here inside the court document, and that led to this tweet on X or Twitter. So as you can see, it's pointing to this various company. And what are they advertising? They're advertising paying people for exploits from $200,000 all the way up to $20 million. At one point, they increased it from $200,000 to $20 million. And apparently, that got someone's attention. Now, I wonder, was this a real trade? Or could this have been a major sting operation? This is just me thinking. Is it possible that maybe there are these kinds of sting operations meant to attract defense contractors who are willing to go outside the rules? I think, that might not be a bad idea to run those kind of sting operations if this is the case. Obviously, I don't support 0 days on our devices whatsoever, but I do wonder if this was a real Russia-backed organization. And it's interesting that they put, as always, the end user is a non-NATO country. Interesting. Why would someone trying to make money care about that? But if you're trying to entrap or, sting operation a defense contractor, you might want to put something like that as just further evidence that they were going against their security clearances. Obviously, just simply accessing this 0-day software and giving it to someone who doesn't have authorized access is obviously already a problem. But this quote just is curious to me. Why does it matter who's going to be the end user? But maybe someone with Russian loyalties or something like that might have an attraction to that. I just wonder, was this a real organization? I haven't looked into Operation Zero, but I just find the whole story kind of interesting. Wondering how they actually tracked him, because if it was a sting operation, and remember, this is just me thinking. If it was a sting operation, that would be very easy to track because, of course, they would be handling the payment if it were a sting operation. Not sure, though. So the charges carry a statutory maximum 10 years in prison. So it sounds like he might get maybe even up to 9 years in prison is what I am reading. And what's interesting is he was actually interviewed, this former executive who's now pled guilty. He was interviewed by the FBI and law enforcement, and he himself admitted that it would be millions of dollars in damage. So law enforcement, when they do an interrogation, they're very good about wiggling around to get information out of it to ensure that the party they're interviewing is giving a good amount of evidence against themselves. Even if they haven't admitted they did it yet, they're pulling some of that information, letting them know they acknowledge $35 million in damage. So he may face up to $300,000 in fines as well. So he was working between Australia and the United States. In some of the documents, they say they believe he pulled this zero-day material off of either U.S.-based District of Columbia or even possibly Australia. As we know, with the Five Eyes, with all of these intelligence partnerships, they work together very closely. And a lot of times, these defense contractors have offices in multiple countries, because it is an alliance after all. So, and the Australian Signals Directorate, of course. So reading through these documents, we can get some more insight into how this happened. So he was working in the United States on a work visa since 2023. And he primarily worked in D.C., so he worked for Company 1, which I believe was the L3 Harris, or possibly the subsidiary, which is known as Trenchant. Now, if you're wondering what kind of exploits, I did look into what Trenchant was. So a lot of it, as it mentions, much of our work is neither public nor publicized. Sounds like a special club. We work with select customers to share ethical standards and have a formal mandate, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's obvious that they work on vulnerability and exploit research, which obviously is some form of a zero-day, some form of an unreleased source code for exploitation. So APIs for intelligence operations, and there's all kinds of exploits in radio hardware, in the various generations of the telecom network, as that is one thing, Stingray, Hailstorm, all of these things do. They want to downgrade your service to a lower generation of the telecom network. And why is that? Well, if you're downgraded, that makes you more exploitable to previous generations of the telecom network's vulnerabilities. I'm really curious what exactly these exploits were. 8 different exploits. So I'm looking into this. I might follow up with some more details if I find anything else. But we can take a look at some of the Trenchant articles, which Trenchant is a subsidiary of L3 Harris. So he worked as an executive for L3 Harris Trenchant, which is the subsidiary that does focus a lot on what it sounds like is zero-day exploitation. So they have some articles to kind of give an idea of the stuff they work on. So while they don't release in the court documents what these 0 days were for, because I did read through all the court documents, at least the public ones, and it shows that they do put focus on Mac OS and some Apple stuff, so various operating systems and some important infrastructure hardware, as you can see with the Siemens PLC software. So they work on all kinds of different spaces. Now, we'll see if we can find some more details on this. So they focused on, making a transaction with this executive at the time. He was an executive, and it led all the way up to 2025. He was the general manager of Company 1, which is the companies we're talking about, Trenchant, L3 Harris. So he was the primary executive in charge of the management and the relationship with Company 2. So Company 1, Company 2, we can surmise is L3 Harris and Trenchant, which is the subsidiary. So it sounds like he was the primary executive in charge of the management of Company 2. So he was very high up. In fact, he was the one overseeing the independent investigation into the loss when they found that these zero-day exploits were out there. So I've read through all of this, but I'm kind of skimming it back with you to share some information you may not find in one place. So they paid him in cryptocurrency, and he got, let's see here. So Company 1's a software development company. It sells cyber intelligence software. It's, surveillance, exploitation, things like that. Things to break the security and the privacy of various devices. So, yeah, and it mentions some of their practices here, how serious they take their security. They have digital swipe door access, so they can identify each person, personal identification number codes, so PIN codes that uniquely identify you as well, personal safes offered to the U.S. employees in a lock company equipment, and, of course, as mentioned, the Faraday boxes, radio frequency shield boxes. So a lot of times, intelligence, like NSA, is known to have copper-lined walls to prevent any kind of signals going in and out of secure areas. I'm sure you've seen the AT&T building, which looks like a giant tower with no windows. All of these are part of the same mass surveillance infrastructure and partnerships between companies now, defense contractors, and the companies themselves. So they were so worried about these products hitting the internet. And unfortunately for them, they had an executive like this former executive who allegedly did this, who allegedly made a knowing transfer of 0 days to a Russian link. At least it was here's the thing, it was a self-identified Russia organization. So of course he's not going to probably sell it to his own country or whatever, because his own country already has access to this. But he probably knows that they'd be interested in something they didn't have access to, and since he was an executive, well, I guess he had that kind of access. And this was to the point where they weren't even able to have any kind of internet access on their computer. So what he did, according to the documents, is he used a hard drive to transfer the files from his the actual machine where he could access it to his personal computer, using a hard drive to transfer that, because after all, they had a strict air gap policy. So this is a Company 3, it says, is based in Russia, advertises itself as a Russian-linked zero-day purchase platform. I would not be surprised if there were false ones like this, like actually ones that were meant to scoop up all of the non-integrity holding defense contractors who may be willing to sell out their national security interests for some money, in this case cryptocurrency. And it sounds like the $200,000 to $20 million really got his attention. And anyway, I guess he thought he was safe. He used an alias called John Taylor, and he used some kind of encrypted communication application, anonymized email account. Probably flawed, but who knows? He may have done what he thought he was doing. But I do wonder about this Russia-linked organization, so I may look further into that. But I thought you may find this interesting, this story about him selling 8 different 0 days. And we can take a look a little further through here. I did find some more details that may be interesting. So, Australian citizen, resided Washington, D.C. As mentioned, he had a visa since 2023. He was known inside the company as Doogie. He made $1.3 million. I'm sure he made a ton of money. It really makes and calls into question, what was his motivation? Was it really the $1.3 million? I'm sure he had a net worth higher than that in the position he was, of course. I believe L3 Harris made $25 billion maybe or so. It was either 25 million or 25 billion last year. Not quite sure. It's somewhere in that range, but I'm sure he got paid quite handsomely. So it makes you wonder what people do. Are they motivated by money, or are they motivated by some ideology or some kind of a belief in an alliance with Russia? Really curious about his true motivations, if it was just the temptation of the crypto. So in 2018, L3Harris, they acquired these different lab startups that produced the 0 days, which merged and became the Trenchant, which he was in charge of. The company sold these hacking tools to the Five Eyes, as we were talking about, which makes up United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So earlier this week, they also reported that 4 former Trenchant employees, the very same company, was investigating a leak of hacking tools. They were suspected of leaking the tools but denied the involvement. Okay, the former development said that Trenchant had scapegoated him. You know, how would you like to work in that kind of a world where you feel like at any moment you could be accused of something you didn't even do? I feel like that's probably quite stressful. Sometimes I wonder if some of the people out there that get convicted actually did it. Just because it sounds like, you know, of course they're going to go after the people who have access, but man, you better hope that they can't find the real person if you didn't do it. Obviously, the tensions are very high. I understand. They work in a high stress environment. It's very serious work, I guess. But still, you always wonder about people being accused of some of these things. I don't think this guy is innocent. I'm not saying that at all. But it is quite an interesting thing. So it sounds like a former developer was being accused when it sounds like it might have been the Williams guy. Huh. Wow. I don't know about that. All right. This is an interesting story. What do you guys think about this? Do you think that this was iPhone exploitation? Do you think it was possibly radio-based, maybe modem-based, generation, 5th generation, 5G network stuff? There are some interesting things out there with things like roaming, which I do recommend turning off with 5G. That's what I got today, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'd love to know what you think. What kind of exploits do you think we're talking about here? Anyone have any info that goes deeper into what 0 days were released? Love to know what that was. They also talk about Chrome OS here and some of the other operating systems they worked on. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think that this was a sting operation? Do you think it was possibly not really a Russian buyer and it was meant to capture those who are going against their national security clearances? What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys soon in another report and video soon, and a tutorial on how to protect your security and privacy.